how does television affect our politics? We have to understand that we're not talking about television as a technology, but television as a medium. There are many places in the world where television, although the same technology as it is in America, is an entirely different medium from that which we know. I refer to places where the majority of people do not have television sets, or where only one station is available, or where television doesn't operate around the clock, or where most programs have as their purpose the direct furtherance of government policy, or where commercials are unknown. In such places, television will not have the same meaning or power as it does in America, which is to say, it is possible for a technology to be used so that its social, economic, and political consequences are quite different from one culture to another. Now, of course, like the brain itself, every technology has an inherent bias, has both unique technical limitations and possibilities. That is to say, every technology has embedded in its physical form a predisposition toward being used in certain ways and not others. Only those who know nothing of the history of technology believe that a technology is entirely neutral or adaptable. What is the problem to which a particular technology is the solution? One must ask, whose problem is it? In the case of the SST, the problem of getting to LA or London faster than 747s could do it was largely a problem for movie stars, rock musicians, and corporate executives. Hardly a problem that most Americans would regard as worth solving if it would cost them a lot of money. But this question, whose problem is it, needs to be applied to any technologies. Most technologies do solve some problem, but the problem may not be everybody's problem or even most people's problem. We need to be very careful in determining who will benefit from a technology and who will pay for it. They are not always the same people. But let's say that we found a technological solution to a problem that most people do have. We now come to the third question. It's this. Suppose we solve this problem and solve it decisively. What new problems might be created because we have solved the problem? The automobile solved some very important problems for most people, but in doing so has poisoned our air, has choked our cities with traffic, and has contributed towards the destruction of some of the beauty of our natural landscape. Antibiotics have certainly solved significant problems for almost all people, but in doing so have resulted in the weakening of what we call our immune systems. Television has solved several important problems, but in solving them has changed the nature of political discourse, has led to a serious decline in literacy, and has even made the traditional process of socializing children difficult, if not impossible. It's doubtful that you can think of any important single technology that did not generate new problems as a result of its having solved an old problem. Of course, it's sometimes very difficult to know what new problems will arise as a result of a technological solution. Benedictine monks invented the mechanical clock in the 13th century in order to be more precise in performing their canonical prayers, which they needed to say 7 times a day. Had they known that the mechanical clock would eventually be used by merchants as a means of establishing a standardized workday and then a standardized product, that is, that the clock would be used as an instrument for making money instead of serving God, the monks might have decided that their sundials was quite sufficient. The people we call Luddites were skilled manual workers in the garment industry at the time when mechanization was taking command and the factory system was being put into place. They knew perfectly well what advantages mechanization would bring to most people. But they also saw with equal clarity how it would bring ruin to their own ways of life, especially to their children, who were being employed as virtual slave laborers in factories. So they resisted technological change by the simplistic and useless expedient of smashing to bits industrial machinery, which they continued to do until they were imprisoned or killed by the British Army. Now, no one knows for sure where the word Luddite came from, but the word has come to mean a person who resists technological change in any way, and it's usually used as an insult. Now, why this is so is a bit puzzling, because, as I said before, only a fool doesn't know that new technologies always produce winners and losers, and there is nothing irrational about loser resistance. What changes in language are being enforced by new technologies? What is being gained and what is being lost by such changes? Now, you will agree that no matter what new media come into our lives, language will remain our most indispensable medium, and it is always a serious matter when new meanings arise and old ones are lost. Think, for example, of how the words community and conversation are now employed by those who use the internet. The word community has traditionally referred to those who have different and even opposing interests, but who find common ground for the sake of political or social harmony. Internet communities are strangers to this conception. They begin in harmony and make no demands on one's capacity for negotiation and tolerance, which is the essence of how communities are formed and sustained. As for conversations, two people who are typing messages to each other are not, in my opinion, having a conversation, in that the most significant aspects of face-to-face communication are simply absent. Now, those who come to believe that emailing is conversation are likely to be people who believe that there is no significant difference between speaking one's sadness face-to-face to a friend who has lost her mother and sending her a Hallmark condolence card. Think of how television has changed the meaning of the phrase political debate. Would Abraham Lincoln or Stephen Douglas recognize such a televised event as a debate? When Lincoln and Douglas were going through Illinois in their debates, they had more than 7, by the way, typically Lincoln would speak for 3 hours, Douglas would speak for 3 hours, and then Lincoln would have 1 hour for rebuttal. Then when they went to Ottawa or Springfield or the next town, then Douglas would speak for 3 hours, Lincoln for 3 hours, and Douglas would have an hour for rebuttal. Here's a debate in America today. Barbara Walters, or some mistress of ceremony, says, the question is, this is for you, President Bush. What is the problem in the Middle East, and how can it be solved? You will have 2 minutes to answer, after which Governor Clinton will have 1 minute to reply. Actually, I think it's a form of mental illness because one would expect, wouldn't one, that President Bush or Governor Clinton would object and say, how dare you ask such a question and give one of us 2 minutes to answer and the other 1 minute to rebut. We're running for the most serious political office perhaps in the world. What is wrong with you? But of course they don't say this. Or they might say, how dare you ask such a question? What kind of people do you think Americans are that they would put up with this? Well, they don't say that either, because we know what kind of people we are. Nonetheless, people do say the next day, did you see the debate? I often imagine what Lincoln or Douglas would, if they could come back and hear us use that word that way. Think of what's happening to the word public or the phrase participatory democracy. Not long ago, I reviewed a book called The Electronic Republic for the LA Times. The author argued that new technologies will make representative democracy obsolete because the technologies will make it possible to have instant plebiscites on every issue. In this way, voters will directly decide if we should join NAFTA or send troops to Bosnia or impeach the president. The Senate and House of Representatives will be largely unnecessary. And this, the author said, is participatory democracy just as it was in Athens in the 15th century BC, the 5th century BC. Now, I have no objection to borrowing a phrase from an older media environment in order to conceptualize a new development. We do it all the time, but it has its risks, and attention must be paid when we do it. To call a train an iron horse, as we once did, may be picturesque, but it obscures the most significant differences between a train and a horse and buggy. To use the term an electronic town hall meeting similarly obscures the differences between an 18th century face-to-face gathering of citizens and a packaged, televised pseudo-event. To use the term distance learning to refer to students and a teacher sending email messages to each other may have some value, but it obscures the fact that the act of reading a book is the best example of distance learning ever invented, because reading not only triumphs over the limitations of space and co-presence, but of time as well. And as for participatory democracy, we would be hard-pressed to find any similarity, whatever, between politics as practiced by 5,000 homogeneous, well-educated, slave-holding Athenians and 250 million Americans doing plebiscites every week, and it's dangerous to allow language to lead us to believe otherwise. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, that citizens ought to be urged to resist language change, only that they need to be aware of how it occurs and why and what sort of attitudes the new uses of language promotes. Here's a sixth question. And you'll recognize that it's related to some of the others, but I give it a special status because of its importance. The question is this: what sort of people and institutions acquire special economic and political power because of technological change? Now, this question needs to be asked because the transformation of a technology into a medium always results in a realignment of economic and political power. And I don't say this as a criticism of anyone, but simply as a fact. A new medium creates new jobs and makes old ones obsolete. A new medium gives prominence to certain kinds of skills and subordinates others. Ronald Reagan, for example, could not have been president were it not for television. This is a man who rarely spoke precisely and never eloquently, and yet he was called the great communicator. Why? Because he was magic on television. His televised image projected a sense of authenticity, tradition, intimacy, and caring. And it didn't much matter if citizens agreed with what he said or even understood what he said. Television gives power to some while it deprives others. And this is true of every important medium. And this fact has always been understood by intelligent entrepreneurs who see opportunities emerging from the creation of new media. That's why media entrepreneurs are the most radical force in culture.
Illiteracy may be an enormous problem in America, but in theory at least, it's easy to remedy. We know how to teach people to read. We lack only the resolve. But what about the problem of, if you will, alliteracy? Those who can read but don't. 2/3 of adults do read well, but a dwindling percentage bother to take the time. As a culture, we're losing the habit of reading. We are exchanging long passages on the printed page for fragments of electronic imagery. That trend poses questions that are not so easily answered. We continue our evaluation with the end of reading. Since the time of Gutenberg, ours has been a culture of the printed word. Almost every human undertaking, politics, communication, education, even religion, has depended upon the written word. We have been a culture of reading. But today, all that is changing. Electronic images are replacing the printed page. As the medium changes, so do the people receiving the message.
America has moved away from typography as the center of people's intellectual and social lives and toward a culture of imagery.
What's the last book I read? I can't remember.
I don't have the time to read books.
What's the last book I read?
The written word no longer plays a central role in culture. And with that being the case, we can assume, and we can also see, that every social institution will alter.
Today, if one reads at all, it is generally a leisure activity, almost a luxury. But it was not so long ago that reading was a necessity.
Americans were readers. There is some evidence that the earliest Americans, at least those in New England, in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, were probably the most literate collection of people that ever existed on Earth. For one thing, they had to know how to read the Bible because they were Calvinist Puritans, and having access to the Word of God, which meant the Bible, was an essential feature of their lives.
But today, of course, access to the Word of God is possible without reading, as is access to just about everything else.
Reading is no longer a central fact in the symbolic environment of Americans. They can pursue their religion, they can pursue their politics, their education, and their commerce, as well as public information via the television set, without reference to almost any other medium.
Once the events of the world came to us daily on these printed pages. But newspapers, too, are being replaced by visual imagery. A major city like New York used to support 11 daily papers. Today, there are only 3.
If you look at USA Today, for example, which is our most successful new national newspaper, you observe, first of all, that it's sold on the streets in receptacles that look like television sets, as if to suggest to people, don't worry. When you buy this newspaper, it'll be just like watching television. But beyond that, when you look at the paper itself, you can see easily how much it's influenced by television. It's mostly a picture newspaper. The stories are very brief and economical.
To the extent that newspapers remain popular, they are under increasing pressure from television to be entertaining, to be headline services, to cater to a public that appears to have an ever-shortening attention span for printed matter.
As a matter of fact, one of the editors of USA Today was quoted as saying that he doubted that any of USA Today's reporters would win any prizes because they don't give awards in journalism for investigative paragraphs.
Many experts in learning explain that television doesn't lend itself to critical thinking. It is passive, basically a medium of entertainment.
The move from a typographic public discourse to an imagistic public discourse tends to trivialize all forms of discourse, tends to make people less aware, less intelligent, less reflective, less analytical. I mean, the best evidence of this would come from what we presently call political debates in America.
For many, the Lincoln-Douglas debates represent political debate in America. Held in an era before television, the debates often lasted more than 7 hours.
Now, these were great social events in Illinois. People brought their children. They brought baskets of food with them. This kind of language was integrated into the social life of people. Today, it's inconceivable that any group of Americans could endure 7 hours of such discourse.
Today's political debates are much shorter. Candidates take about 2 minutes to answer a question, 60 seconds to rebut.
I am not going to exploit for political purposes my opponent's youth and inexperience.
When you look at how those, in quotes, debates were treated by the press, you see that they were referred to as sort of boxing events. Reagan KOs Mondale, or Mondale wins on points. Afterwards, most of the commentary concerned the style of the men. People said Reagan in the first debate looked unsure of himself, or that later on he looked good. Mondale looked in the second debate somewhat distant or aloof. I mean, these are the comments people make about what we presently call political debates on television. Content is almost insignificant, as any good television director knows.
There are signs that education, too, is moving from the printed word to the non-print media. In this Philadelphia classroom, the rules of grammar are set not on the pages of textbooks, but rather to the rhythms of rap music. Students learn by listening rather than reading.
I have to worry quite a bit about the negative influences that much of the media has on the images and concept that boys and girls evolve. The tapes that my boys and girls are now using have had a really positive influence because it's something they readily can identify with. It's exciting, it's motivating, and it stimulates them to learning.
Where you been? I rap with Reggae, now back again. If you can't find a job, you're in a hell of a fix. Reaganomics got you in a bag of tricks.
Philadelphia disc jockey Jocko Henderson is credited with having invented rap learning.
Those kids who are doing my program now, pardon my conceit, but they'll never forget it as long as they live. The kids who you hear saying three little words we often see are articles A, N, and V. A noun is the name of anything, as school or garden, house or swing. They'll never forget it. We didn't forget Humpty Dumpty or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star, and they won't forget this either. No way.
If the schools try to replicate what television does, that is, if the classroom was just filled with visual stimulation and music and no discourse more than 8 minutes and so on, then I think the game is up. Then it's quite likely that, except for very few people, most youngsters will be disabled from learning in any other way.
As an educational force, could television become part of the solution, not just part of the problem? The people at Sesame Street think so.
When I was doing the study for Carnegie that led to Sesame Street, I was watching a 3 or 4-year-old niece of mine, and I noticed she was playing on the floor and not watching television except during the commercial, and then she'd whip around and watch the commercial. And parent after parent reported that phenomenon about the preschool child. And I said, since it's compelling, since every child in America was singing beer commercials and so on, and were identifying words in supermarkets that they'd seen on, it seemed pretty clear to me that the commercial technique could be used for something more constructive than selling them product, and that it might teach them letters and numbers.
One of the important dangers, perils, of the Sesame Street approach to education is that it teaches the young that entertainment and learning are inseparable. Now, I'm not speaking here in behalf of one's being boring in the classroom, but it must be perfectly obvious to everyone that not all learning is entertaining, that there is an arduousness to learning some things. So I worry about Sesame Street because it may be raising a population of youngsters who will have no patience for any rigor or durability in the learning process.
I think, with all due respect to Mr. Postman, I think he is actually wringing his hands about the late 20th century. I don't see television as perhaps the worst thing that's ever happened, because I think, given that it is here and that it's not going to go away, we ought to be seriously discussing how to make it safer, better, enlightening. And I am not going to apologize for Sesame Street. I think it was a step in the right direction. I wish that many, many other steps had been taken. That's my only regret.
One thing that television has done is provide everyone with equal access to vast amounts of information quickly. That may seem like a wholly positive development, but it may not be.
When you go into the classroom, when you go into high school classrooms and college classrooms, one is astounded at how much kids know. It is, one might say, broad and thin, but it is broad. I think the in-depth learning has probably been hurt by taking images in, by getting your information via visual images.
Gaddafi's a madman. He's, very void of any rationale.
Oh, Gaddafi is a frightening person, I believe.
Well, Gaddafi needs to be taken care of.
Yes, I think there is much more of the illusion of knowledge. That's what I meant by young people are smarter in some ways, that their knowledge is broad but thin. And we are getting quick impressions.
You know where Libya is?
What? Well, geographically? Yeah. Like what street or something like that?
Well, not what street, but just generally, where is it?
Thank you.
Generally, no, I couldn't tell you where it is. It's probably off of Saudi Arabia.
I don't know where it is.
Somewhere over there in Asia.
When a culture disdains literacy for the important functions of public discourse and replaces that with a medium that focuses on format and style and therefore entertainment, then you begin to get, you have a situation comparable to what Huxley meant by the drug soma, that everyone is kept sort of pacified, amused, entertained. President Reagan is entertaining. Dan Rather is entertaining. Even the nightly news, for all of its gory stories, is entertaining because the film footage is exciting. The religion on television is amusing. Commercials are very amusing and entertaining. So that as we move into this imagistic culture of short duration, dynamic and amusing images, we have a population that becomes pacified, that no longer is capable of the kind of sustained reflection and analytical thought that I think is usually characteristic of literate cultures where typography is vital to every day's functioning.